Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Daniel, and I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a nonprofit information sharing organization. I'm very excited to be joined today by Michael Sikorski, and I will let him introduce himself, but I should say that he is one of our newest board members for the Cyber Threat Alliance. So I'm even more glad to have him on to talk about ransomware and what we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's been great to join the board. It's great seeing you earlier this week.
Yep.
Give a brief background on myself. I am the CTO and VP of Engineering for Unit 42 at Palo Alto Networks, where we do threat intelligence, consulting services. We're talking about incident response today, some ransomware, do a lot of those investigations, analyze the malware from that, all of that, and then how everything we do flows into the greater product ecosystem at Palo. And then my background is straight out of college. I was at the NSA for 5 years. And then I joined a small startup that quickly changed their name to Mandiant when I joined. And I was there for 15 years. Sort of bookend on that is APT1 all the way to up until SolarWinds. Yeah, so excited to be here and talk with you today.
Great. And just to be clear, there are not units 1 through 41 at Palo Alto Networks. Unit 42 does have a nice geeky, nerdy reference point, right, Mike?
Yeah, so if you're not familiar, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the part of the story was there's a computer going to calculate the meaning of life, the universe, everything. After 1,000 years, the galaxy came back to hear from that computer, and it just spit out the number 42. So that's where we get our name from.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the topics that we wanted to talk about today, the prime topic, is really on ransomware. And a lot is changing in the ransomware space, right? And it is certainly still a threat. And in many ways, it has, it's sort of faded from a bit of the front page news since 2021, when there was so much activity and so many high profile attacks. But the threat has really continued to evolve. And a lot of people now are familiar with the basic idea of a ransomware attack, right? A malicious actor encrypts your computer, demands payment in exchange for the decryption key. A lot of people have even heard of double extortion, where they steal the data before they encrypt it, and then they threaten to leak it if you don't pay. But now we're seeing bad guys use even additional techniques to get people to pay. So what are we seeing in some of the changes and those additional tactics that the bad guys are now employing to try to extract money from people?
Yeah, I mean, ransomware's been evolving, right? And I think some of it's evolving not just from the ability for it to occur, right? The cryptocurrencies, exchanges getting really popular, making it easy to get anonymous payment caused a big surge in evolution, obviously. But what happens is we're seeing other things influence the ransomware market, so to speak, things like insurance, stuff like that. So people's posture, security posture specifically surrounding their data is a lot different than it was. So people have backups now. Well, not everyone, but lots of people have backups that didn't before, and they're actually conscious of it because they can't get cybersecurity insurance if they're not properly backed up, because the insurance knows that's a risk. So we're actually seeing is a trend of encryption's actually happening less, where not as many of the time we're doing the investigation, encryption is occurring. And why is encryption going down? Well, it's going down because people aren't paying as much. People are saying, you know what, I'm not going to pay the ransom. I have backups. I'm going to restore. I'll lose a little bit here and move on with my life. Because like you said, they're much more aware of ransomware as a threat. So they're taking these precautions to be ready for it. So guess what? The threat actor is now going to say, well, if you're not going to pay me when I encrypt, I'm going to do other things. And so we're seeing the threat actor come into an environment and dwell on the network a little bit longer. And what they're doing during that time is they're performing data theft. They're stealing customer data. They're stealing employee data. They're stealing credentials to log into websites, cloud, you name it. They're getting all of that data, and then they're encrypting. And if you don't pay on the encryption, then they say, well, we stole all your data. How would you like it if we leaked it on the dark web? How would you like it if we sold it? How would you like it if we put your employee data out there for everybody to see? And then in addition to threatening, which is a double extortion that you said of like leaking this data, we've also seen them threaten denial of service. So, hey, I stole your credentials. I could take down your sites for a day. How much is that worth to you? Maybe your whole business is online. And if we take that down for a day, that's extremely costly. And then finally, we're seeing the threat actors go to like a really dark place, is what I've been calling it, is where they're willing to to harass people to a level that we haven't seen before, where they're saying, hey, we're willing to, not just leak your data and shut down your access and things like that, but we're going to start harassing your customers, harassing your employees. We have a CEO whose wife is getting text messages from the threat actor. We have a CIO I was talking with saying, I wish I would have paid the ransom. Like, why, we didn't pay it because we thought we had good enough with the backups, but the amount that they're harassing my customers is beyond belief, and like pretending to be that company harassing customers. So the customers thinks it's all this spam and everything's coming from the business, but it's not. It's the threat actor. And so this level of harassment is just really surging.
Yeah, so, I mean, we've also seen, or certainly I've seen examples of the bad guys threatening to go to data protection authorities and, turn over the data to government agencies and, say basically, hey, look, this company did a crappy job protecting their data, so go punish them. Which is particularly galling, right? The idea that the bad guys are going to leverage a piece of the government to, get you to pay a ransom. It just somehow or another seems particularly annoying to me, at least.
Yeah, no, but government policy is certainly coming into play when it comes to these types of attacks, right? Like we're seeing a lot of policies been rolled out since SolarWinds, since the oil pipeline, so on and so forth, where they're starting to have policies about what you need to report and then even who you can pay. So you might say, oh, well, the payment's going down because of backups. You could also say payments going down because of government policy, where you're not even allowed to pay certain ransomware gangs because they're, you can't pay these terrorists. You can't do this due to government policy. And then to top it off, you actually have to worry about reporting it. And how does this get leaked out? And we've seen these leak sites for these ransomware gangs explode, where everybody's following them and seeing, who gets on the leak list as soon as possible. And we're seeing this just in the last couple of weeks with Clop and the Move It vulnerability, where their leak site just has tremendous amount of companies. Now we don't know how much each of them were actually impacted unless we did the incident response, but the ransomware gang's putting their name out there with some data.
Yeah. And so what do you think the scale or volume of these newer techniques is, like compared to like the typical sort of what we think of as the standard ransomware attack?
Yeah, so we're actually been collecting stats on this. I think between the amount we're working it, I think we're doing about 5 ransomware engagements every single week. So it's a lot that we're doing ourselves, but then, combine it with all the intelligence collections we do, the leak sites, the relationships we have with entities around the world. We work closely with Interpol, FBI, on these, monitoring these gangs' activities. So we feel like we have pretty good statistics to take a look at this, and we can go year over year. And, we saw the harassment last year, so we go 2022 versus this year, is like harassment is up to 20% of the time we're seeing it, versus it was under 1% about a year ago. And that 20% is going up. So that means every single week we deal with a case where harassment is involved in some way. So, and it just seems to be going up and up and up. And then when you look at data theft, that went from 40% to 70%. And so we actually put out a report that we do annually on ransomware and extortion and these trends that we're seeing. But see data theft go from 40 to 70% and harassment go from 1 to 20%. These are major leaps that we need to prepare for, and that's a big part of what you need to consider as a CISO, as if you deal with one of these incidents, is you got to look at the whole picture. You can't just say, is my data backed up? Am I ready to go? It's what is the gang I'm dealing with? What are they known to do? What is the recommended course of action? Are they going to leak my data anyway? I need to prepare for that. Are they going to publish me on a leak site tomorrow? I got to prepare for that. You need to think through the overall picture, whether or not you pay now versus just is my data safe? You know, am I going to be able to recover?
Right. Well, and of course, there's also the, you know, I mean, it's also inevitable that if you do pay, right, you go on the list of entities that pay that the bad guys send around, right? So, you know, there's definitely some research out there, you know, that I've seen that sort of definitely correlates if you've paid before, you're more likely to be targeted again, you know, for subsequent ransomware. So, I mean, it's a very complex issue for a lot of, for any company, really.
Well, that's true. You could also spin the same concept onto the ransomware gangs themselves. And they actually have almost a reputation score in a way where we know that, hey, the last 5 times we saw that gang, they did this. And so we can make that call. And we even engage with them, right? Because we're negotiating on behalf of the company, like how much the ransom is and things like that. But you could spin it on them of, hey, if you're not going to do what you say when we pay this ransom, we're going to know that. And the next attack we see you at, maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe a year from now, we're going to advise the client differently based on how you act. And so it's almost like these gangs of criminals obviously have like reputations and reputation scores in a way of like, how likely are they to leak? How are they still going to do it after you pay it? Are they going to come back a month later and try something else? Like, all of that is into play, and they know that. And so we see them acting certain ways, you know, to their interests of keeping this gravy train going.
Sure. And I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but can you sort of illuminate a little bit more like how these additional techniques and things are changing the ransomware response business?
Yeah. So from the business perspective itself, it's kind of an interesting. I would say incident response overall has been it has been interesting to see evolve and shift over the years. In the early days, I started doing incident response like in 2007. A lot of it was, as I mentioned, APT1. So I was chasing China out of networks all around the US, going from company to company, doing that. And a lot of times we'd show up and, you know, it'd be like they'd been there for a year. The attacker had been there for a year or two. You never figure out how they got in. And now, you know, with ransomware and then sort of also business email compromise, which is, you know, probably equal to ransomware as far as prevalence goes. Those you're able to realize much quicker that an attacker is in your environment. And so you can start doing things like realizing how they got in. And so, you know, you can, because the data is still there, the logs are still there. You could even get the phishing email if that's what it was, or the vulnerability that was leveraged. We could even point to specific vulnerabilities that were used in the attack much better than we could many years ago doing incident response, because the time is much more crunched. And furthermore, people are doing logging and saving it, and they have SIEMs and all this other stuff. So there's a lot more data to go off of. Now, the opposite side of that is, well, that's good because we can figure out how people are getting in, and then we can do better defenses against that, better user training, so on and so forth. You know, you have to also think about the flip side is incident response is not the same as it used to be. And a lot of that is insurance companies and other things involved here, where, you know, the idea of coming on site and doing really extensive incident response where you're there for a long haul to figure out every single piece of evidence and everything that's gone down, that's less frequent because, you know, if insurance is involved, now the business has to make decisions of, well, the insurance says this engagement is this long. How long? What does that mean, right? And you get to the end of that. Do you keep your incident response team there, and do you do more work? And that's like a business decision, right? Of like, how far do I take this? How far do I go into the remediation activities? And those are much more complicated conversations to have when you do have the insurance involved, right? Versus in the
Right.
past, it might have been, well, there was no insurance, and it was just the advisor is telling me to keep going, so I'm going to keep going, or just cut it off because we don't have the ability or money to do that. And I think it's interesting to say, well, if you're cutting off an incident early, it's a very bad thing, because a lot of times you're not able to fully get the attacker out unless you really do a comprehensive IR and a proper remediation plan. And a lot of people, especially when it comes to ransomware, are focused so much on that one thing that I think it can be a little short-sighted at times, where you'll do a ransomware engagement for someone, and sure enough, months later, because not enough time was spent performing the incident response process and really doing a thorough remediation, they find themselves in another incident response engagement,
Right.
not for the same ransomware, not even for ransomware, sometimes something totally different, but because the time wasn't spent to really figure everything out and really go the extra mile, they weren't able to go to that place.
Mike, I've lost your audio. What happened there? But
Can you still hear me okay?
yep, now I got you back.
Okay. All right.
All right. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, right? Because I mean, rarely does a company that's been breached, right, either, with a ransomware attack or, with a business email compromise, rarely do they only have one problem, right? Usually there's multiple problems there. And so that so if all you do is focus on exactly what happened with that particular incident, you're actually not necessarily helping them to the maximum extent you can to be ready to deal with other things, right? And so some of what you would hope is that after they've suffered an incident, that's a good opportunity to actually fix a whole bunch of things that might be wrong with the network, or, weaknesses that they might have.
And that definitely does occur. I shouldn't be too doom and gloom of like people don't do the proper thing with incident response. A lot of times, some people do, some people can't afford to. Like, again, everything's a business decision at the end of the day. And, if it's going to be a full overhaul of the way you do security and building out a stock and doing all the, bringing in the products that are necessary, like it could be, depending on the size of your business, you need to think through what's the most efficient way to do that. And so, sometimes they are doing what they need to, and they do a lot of follow-up. And then other times it's like, okay, IR's over, we're on to the next thing, and they just keep rolling on. So it really depends what's going on. But a big thing too is like, it's still education of users is a big thing, right? Phishing attacks is still one of the top things out there, right? And we pushed a lot of people to implement MFA, which was a great thing, and got that out there, rolled out. But what it ends up happening is we see, instead of social engineering just to get the password, they're now social engineering to try and get that MFA token, right? So we see smishing attacks growing. We see, they want to get that token off your phone so that they can get in, right? And we see a lot of active campaigns just for that purpose. They're pretty successful. People have a lot of fatigue with regards to their phone, well, in general, but also with MFA, where it's popping up. They're very likely to still click accept, even though it's not actually them doing it. A lot of these systems, HR systems, the Workdays of the world, things like that people are logged into throughout the day, will often auto log them out and send them a push like, are you still logged in? And if they're out to lunch or something, they're very likely to say, I want to stay logged in. I want to keep my screen where it's at, so when I get back to my desk, it works. And we're seeing a lot of successful attacks that way. In fact, we were responding to an incident where it took 14 days for the users to stop giving over tokens to the attacker, and to the point that they implemented a policy, which we're seeing a lot of people do now, of not even allowing push notifications anymore. Either a push notification with a code that also needs to be verified from the computer screen, or just, hey, back to the days of you need to enter the code. And we're seeing just so many organizations, especially the ones that have had an incident because of it, just completely move away from that type of logging in.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a good reminder that, the bad guys are going to continue to evolve. They're going to adapt their techniques. I mean, there's just too much money on the table for them, right? So one thing that's been interesting to me as we sort of look at what was happening back, say, in 2021 with ransomware attacks, it feels like to me that bad guys are targeting some different organizations now than they were a few years ago. And that they seem to have sort of backed off of some of the really large companies like Colonial Pipeline and have, kind of gone one layer down below that to try to, I think, partially to stay off the radar screen, but also because the bigger the company, the more likely they are to have a dedicated cybersecurity team. They are more likely to have invested, more in cybersecurity. And so it makes them a tougher target. And so they seem to have gone kind of one layer down in the size of companies. But I don't know if that is reflective of what, you're seeing at Palo Alto.
Oh yeah, for sure. We're seeing, sort of ransomware going down market is kind of what you're describing. It's definitely occurring. And a lot more people have cyber policies than ever before. We're even seeing intrusions where the attacker will come in and find that insurance policy document, pull it, and know how much is on that policy, so they know what they could get out of the business. And I think sort of what I mentioned early on is that pivot to harassment, right, is kind of a dark place for them to go, like harassing versus just, it's almost like I miss encryption versus seeing harassment,
Right.
Because encryption is it just hurts files, doesn't hurt people like that. And I think the same thing goes with the sort of ethics about who they're willing to go after. Like you said, they were kind of going after, banks, the hacktivists going after, certain entities, certain banks, things like that, was kind of the trend for a while. But like you said, they sort of moved to other targets. And we've seen some gangs come out where they're willing to kind of stoop low, right? I think hospitals and schools kind of used to be off limits generally. Obviously, we had some things, ransomware that was kind of mass spread, things like WannaCry and NotPetya.
Right. Yeah.
Those were mass spread and they ended up taking down hospitals and stuff like that. But that was more due to the vulnerability being out of control and how that ransomware spread years ago. Now it's more very point, right? They come into the network and then they kind of deploy stuff. But we are seeing them willing to go after hospitals, willing to go after schools, like the Vice Society group going after school systems, leaking student medical records, hospitals. We've seen hospitals not pay, and then the patients get harassed and asked for ransom for their data to not go out, like that level of harassment. And I think that, you mentioned the height in 2021, or even a year or two before that, they weren't really going after those targets to the extent we're seeing them now, where we're doing schools often, right? And these are entities with not a lot of money.
Right.
They don't have a lot. They don't have. It was hard enough for them to move online during COVID, to then, from a tech perspective, to let alone think about cybersecurity and ransomware is like, it's way down on their list, right? They're just trying to get the students taught. And so they're kind of like sitting ducks in a way. And it makes it really hard for them to get the proper resources they need to even protect against this. And then when they are getting ransomed, it's like, how much money are you going to get really out of the school system? So I think it's interesting to see the attackers kind of stoop to that level and be willing to do whatever it takes. I mean, it shows that they're kind of, the way they operate is this business model where it's like doesn't matter anymore. They're just about how do we get in, how do we encrypt, how do we get our money out, and then we're on to the next one. And it's just, that's the mentality.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting question in my mind about how these different techniques and things are going to affect how ransomware is perceived by the public, or by governments, right? Because I think in many ways, certainly, one of the things that I've seen over, 10, 15 years in this business, right, is that, people often sort of perceive a lot of cybercrime as effectively victimless, right? Or the victims have been like, nobody's going to cry if a large bank loses some money, right? Like just from a
Generally, it's true. Listen,
yeah,
listen to your bank, maybe.
yeah. I mean, and it's so they weren't, a lot of the targets weren't particularly sympathetic, right? But now, if you're talking about like harassing CEOs' wives or spouses, right? If you're talking about if you're talking about a lot of targeting of hospitals and, like that changes the nature of it and makes it much more, to me, it makes it much more personal and makes it a lot more like sort of less victimless, and like very clearly there's a victim, and suddenly this is starting to look a lot more like, other kinds of crime. And it, I mean, and for those of us who have been in the business have long known this, right? But I think it does, at least to my mind, it affects how the public more generally, and how governments will actually react to, these kinds of incidents. And it probably, in my view, puts more pressure on governments to step up the activity against these, criminal organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. I think it hits home a lot more. I mean, to be honest, we didn't have a lot of government policy doctrine. We saw how much has unfolded once people, once the oil pipeline happened, right? And we had people not pumping gas. We realized that, hey, this could be an attack on the infrastructure that could cause really things that impact my life of like how I do things. And then what you're saying is, yeah, like your hospital, your medical records, your school systems, like these are targets that are really disruptive and really present in people's lives of like, whoa, that's like you said, like one thing to hack a bank and steal money if they have lots of it. It's another thing to kind of go after a small or super small, mom and pop kind of shop and it de-encrypting their network and asking for small sums of money that could put the whole business out, right, out of business. And school systems, right, like how they even can deal with it is like a really challenging situation. So I think for sure, and I think it's been great to see all the policy that has been put into place. I think you can even tie it to much further beyond like we talk about government sharing. I mean, it's unbelievable how amazing the revolution has been over the last few years when it comes to sharing in general. We see government agencies establishing collaboration centers. Like when I was at the NSA 20 years ago, it was like the idea of that was very it was kind of like unheard of. But
Right.
now they have full collaboration centers
Yeah.
where they're literally like trying to share actively, and realizing that the days of like let's classify IP addresses are kind of moving away of like, hey,
Yeah.
the infrastructure goes up and down so quickly, and that level of engagement and willingness to collaborate and share has been, I think, revolutionary. And we've seen sort of the proof in that in the situation in Ukraine and Russia, right, where that collaboration has been so helpful. And I think some of that goes to these ransomware gangs, like I mentioned, even Interpol and FBI. There's a lot of sharing there too, of trying to say, hey, what is it that we're seeing, and how do we track these people? And it's going a lot better, I think, than it ever has, because of that willingness to collaborate. And again, all stemming from the last few years and some of these really big, impactful hacks that occurred.
Yeah. So as we kind of bring this conversation to a close, as we are dealing with this sort of new phase of ransomware, how are you thinking about advising, companies? Like, how do you start preparing for these different kinds of, techniques, and, how do you, basically, what should you be doing? I mean, obviously
Yeah,
still doing backups, right? Because like we don't want to get away from that. That's a good practice to have, but
yeah. I mean, when you start to look at an overall security posture, there's so many different places that can take it, right? I mean, certainly your users are a pretty weak link. When I talked about phishing, and it's kind of scary to think about too when we start to look at AI technologies, right? And ChatGPT has kind of brought that to these LLMs have really changed the game when it comes to AI, but also when you look at security applications. I think if phishing is still the number one way that they're getting in, at least in the IRs we're responding to, been some big vulnerabilities, your log4js, your proxy shells, stuff like that. But phishing is still a weak link. Now think about how well equipped attackers are when they start applying LLMs, and we see them talking in their forums, sharing with each other on how to leverage those. And so the days of sort of broken English spear phishing attack that is spotted pretty easily is gone. And they could even do things like, grab your whole inbox, which might have thousands of emails you've personally written, and they could then feed that and say, speak like this person and sound like them, and build a rapport online, either via email or chat, or who knows where it's going to go, and make that lure a lot more tempting to click or make a payment like never before. And we're seeing a lot of that where somebody, in business email compromise, their whole inbox get compromised, and then they're really extracting the payments. Then you also look at the cloud. I think a lot of people are very quickly moving to the cloud, and not all of them know what they're doing. They're hiring people they think that know what they're doing, and they're making a lot of mistakes there. And I think, when I look at sort of what could happen next week, I think we're looking towards a massive sort of cloud issue for somebody when it comes to ransomware, right? People are just not doing things right there, and not putting in hard-coded credentials, not having the proper authentication. They have like the most sophisticated logging, backups, encryption, you name it, for everything enterprise, but then you look in the cloud and they're not doing any of that.
Right.
And so there's been interesting situations we've run into where it's like, this happened to you, but you're really lucky all this other stuff didn't happen to you, based on we look at your cloud security and the posture you have there. So yeah, those are just some spots that I see.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me today. The ransomware threat it's not going anyplace anytime soon. It's going to continue to be a lucrative line of business for the bad guys, unfortunately. And I think we as the security industry, along with governments and others, have to continue to work to figure out how to make it less lucrative for the bad guys, and figure out how to reduce reduce how much money they're making from it. So there's still a lot more work to be done. And I think it's a good example. This discussion today really shows how, if you're working in this area, we need to continue to think, 2 or 3 moves down the chessboard of, as we improve backups, as we improve other things, how could the bad guys shift, right? Where could they go? What could they do? And can we start to, get ahead of that?
But I do think, back to the point earlier, is sharing is a huge part of that. And I mentioned the government sharing is going up, but look at the CTA, right? And that's why I'm excited about being part of the mission, because even the idea of cybersecurity companies sharing with each other years ago, when I was first getting into the business, was like unheard of, right? And that's exactly what the CTA is all about. So I'm excited to be a part of that mission of how do we gamify the situation and increase that collaboration? Because, to be honest, the more that we do that, the better we're going to be in doing exactly what you said, protecting everyone. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk with me today. And I will look forward to seeing you at many different board meetings down the road.
Sounds good.
Excellent.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.